Connor Tomlinson, welcome to the next generation.
Well, thank you.
You say you're going to get the revolutionary Gen Z. It's just which flavour you get. Do you get woke communists or do you get the reactionaries? What do you mean by that?
What does he mean by this? Yes. So when I went on Trig, I outlined this distinction between the political divide, which often runs among gendered lines, but between generations. So generations are a very 20th century concept, and they're determined by technological change and the adaptation to technological change. So let me lay this out. So the boomer generation, sort of after the Second World War, right up until about 1969, were defined by the birth control pill. This is why they're very freedom-oriented. This is why they think that a lot of the welfare-based entitlement programs are owed to them because they worked as individuals to pay into them. Complete transformation of how the sexes got along, how you thought of yourself as an individual who worked rather than as a member of a household. And then Gen X adapted to that, and that's why you had lad culture, that's why you had men and women drinking in the same pubs. That's why whenever you get, let's say, dating advice as a young man, and you go to your parents who are sort of in their 40s, and they always go, I'll go to the pub and just chat up a girl, because that's how, in the small window of time, that's how they interacted. For millennials and Gen Z, that technological transformation was the internet. The millennials had a very curated version of the internet, and some of us on the permeable barrier, I was 98, so, 1 year after Gen Z got initiated. Some of us had the same frame of reference, so we remember similar internet memes at the early end of YouTube, which was Nyan Cat, Annoying Orange, Ounce Charlie, probably all play Club Penguin, things like that. But as you go down the generational brackets, particularly after 2014 with the advent of the smartphone and then the explosion of social media, you get a lot less curated social media experience. So you end up falling down your own internet rabbit holes or finding your own internet tribe that was originally around fandoms on things like Tumblr. Eventually it's become more political along the lines of Twitter or those awful gauche Instagram Canva graphics that pretty much every basic, I won't swear, girl posts to her story thinking that she's some social justice paragon. And so what you get out of that is two very distinct political tribes. You get people that are fed their political opinions by an algorithm. My friend Mary Harrington calls this people of the omni cause. This is why Greta Thunberg is protesting for climate change one day and wearing the Palestinian keffiyeh the other day. It's whatever shows up on her social media algorithms and whatever shows up on everyone else's, which sets the social incentives for which causes you care about, even if they're kind of incoherent. Same with Queers for Palestine for the like. And then you get the reactionaries who are looking around them at their civilization. They're using that less curated tool of the internet to reclaim the wisdom of the past, reading their own texts, looking up old videos, things like that. And they're thinking, right, we've got problems in the present. What wisdom from the past can we use to solve those problems? And so they're taking initiative, they're learning for themselves, they're returning to traditional religions, they're abandoning modern dating, they're becoming more socially conservative. And so they couldn't be further apart than the people that are just fed political opinions like their algorithmic slop. And this is why you're seeing a gender divide in everywhere except, fortunately, after the American election, part of America and the French and some of the Germans. You're seeing a gender divide between men and women because lots of young women who have grown up on social media, who are more susceptible to social pressure, are more likely to follow those trends. They're more likely to post the black square. They're more likely to say trans lives matter, even though there are threats to women's safety. They're more likely to hold to what Rob Henderson would call luxury beliefs, trying to communicate their sworn fealties out to various social issues that might not actually put a cost upon them, but will put out a cost because the policies aren't workable when enacted in the future. Whereas lots of young men, because they're the public enemy number one of this intersectional pyramid of oppression, if you're a straight white young man, you've basically got a bounty on your head by every institution in this country. So they go, okay, the current social order isn't serving me. Let's find another social order which is more workable, that doesn't have all the problems of the current socially liberal order. And so they're mainly going back to church. They're trying to seek out traditional relationships. They're seeking out strong male role model figures in the guises of Jordan Peterson or a Chris Williamson or a Joe Rogan, and they're voting for more right-wing parties like the AfD in Germany, the Freedom Party in Austria, National Rally in France, or Trump in the US. So those are the two power bases. It's woke intersectionals determined by algorithms and people, predominantly young men, but an increasing share of young women, as we've seen in the States, that are looking towards the wisdom of the past and trying to revitalize tradition using the tools of the present.
I often lambast social media, and rightly so. It's caused so many problems that you've just so eloquently outlined. But I wonder if we could maybe have a go at steel manning this revolutionary Gen Z and look into what the positives are of these algorithms, and actually maybe if it's a good thing that we are at least exploring these issues and we're so passionate about these issues. This goes against what I believe, but I think it's worth a try nonetheless to see the positives of this technology.
I think that lots of technological change, if it's not ergonomic to human flourishing, can be adapted to, but only by a very small minority. And you can see this through the inventive Twitter anons who were lurking around before Elon took over. It's just that as soon as Elon took the restraining bolts off of the thing, then they start to flourish. They're very inventive. I'm thinking of my friend Charles Cornishdale, who runs Raw Egg Nationalist, or the guy who runs the Lomez account, who's got a brand new publishing imprint that will print books that the regular, very feminized publishing houses wouldn't ever do. I had a brush with this myself, by the way, because I had my own book proposal cancelled after working for a year on it, and I'm having to start from ground zero. Or one of my favourite accounts, Cunley Druckpa, who keeps getting referenced on GB News these days. It turns out that even some of these Anon accounts are doing such good research and circumventing the gatekeepers in traditional press and mainstream media, they're now getting cited in Parliament. There was an Anon account that goes by the name Juice. I don't remember the actual numbers after the name, but he kept putting out statistics about social housing by immigrant background. This was then taken up as data when it was turned into a chart and cited by a member of Parliament in a parliamentary debate, which then led to the Centre for Policy Studies report by now Shadow Justice Minister Robert Jenrick, which then completely changed the conversation on immigration. So you can use these tools, the sort of modern Gutenberg press, to circumvent the censors, playing it a bit clever, adapt to the way that the means of communication have changed, and therefore have an outsized impact on the debate, because more and more people are adopting to this technology. And so it means that the old traditional methods of silencing and manipulating the narrative are working less and less. And this is why European political parties on the continent, Donald Trump, have wised up to this. They've been using new media, they've been using podcasts, they've been using TikTok, they've been using Twitter, and it's delivered them success where traditionally they would have just gone on the BBC for an hour and got called racist every few seconds.
Well, to follow this thread of algorithms programming the way we see the world and ourselves, what do you think to this emerging trend of using that as an autodidact like myself, who hasn't gone to university, and curating my wisdom and knowledge of the world through purely online creators? Do you see equal benefit like this legislation that's gone through Parliament potentially, or do you see that it can actually quickly fall down a very dangerous trap of not being peer reviewed and researched, just random people spouting their beliefs and claiming that they're the rules of the universe?
I think because of the replication crisis you've seen in the social sciences and the complete, let's say, circular masturbatory junk that comes out the humanities departments, peer review is actually a lot less useful than it used to be. The problem is the accreditation system. If you want to go in a corporate job, or you want to go be a medical professional, be a lawyer and the like, you still have to jump through the hoops of the traditional universities. But we see things like Peterson Academy, which are starting up. We don't know to what extent that's going to be accepted as a qualification, but they've still got some undoubted academic pedigree, like my friends Eric Kaufman and James Orr doing courses there. And they are circumventing the traditional university system, giving a classical education. Same things happening down the lower rungs of the ladder, with more Americans choosing to homeschool because as was unveiled during COVID, the American school system is completely rotten from the Department of Education all the way on down, with woke indoctrination, critical race theory, gender ideology, and the like. So anything you can do to get around that is very healthy. As far as people falling down, let's say, misinformation rabbit holes, yes, there are some bad actors online, but I'm actually a lot less worried about how people adapt to the internet and over time learn to filter out non-credible stuff, despite the amount of slop that's on places like Twitter, than I am allowing the government to determine what is and isn't true. Because even if you could, let me invert that. There are people that will turn around and say, well, The problem with censorship is that there's never an impartial, arbitrary standard to apply, therefore we can't trust them. And I'll say, understood. That's a fairly convincing argument. I'll go one step further. Whenever they do try to apply censorship measures and monitor the internet, it's for ultimately nefarious reasons. I have made it a pet obsession in the last year to dig through the activity of what the UK Home Office has been doing. This week, a report was released by a former government advisor called Dame Sarah Khan. She paid a communist activist group called Hope Not Hate, who, while she was working at the Home Office and her sister was running what we would call the propaganda department, called Raiku, which responds to the aftermath of terror attacks by telling newspapers what to run on their front pages. They funded this group. Hope Not Hate did the survey for it, and what hit the headlines was a majority of young men have a positive opinion of Andrew Tate. So what we need is a department in the Cabinet Office and the new department in the Department of Education to monitor this content as it goes online and to speak to young men under the age of 18 to tell them the harmful misogynistic content. Right, I'm not an Andrew Tate fan. Do I think the state's resources are being well spent on lecturing young men on toxic masculinity? No. And do I think the state, who have allowed actual Islamic terrorists to slip through the net of their anti-radicalization program while monitoring people they call far right for reading things like The Lord of the Rings in 1984, and I wish I was making that up, but that's in government documents. Do I trust them to censor the internet when that's the parameters of what they're doing? No. I say, let it run wild, even if I think some of the accounts that Elon quote retweets sometimes are questionable.
Break that down for me. What was that quote about 1984?
Okay, so in 2023, there was a report by a guy called William Shawcross, and he looked into the government's anti-radicalization program, which is called Prevent. Anyone who works in schools will be familiar with this. They get annual Prevent training to spot the signs of radicalization, to see if predominantly young men are going off the beaten path. And it was meant to be a strategy to curb terrorism. William Shawcross said, "It is worth reiterating that Islamic terrorism in this country is still the most dangerous threat presented because 80% of counterterrorism police operations, open investigations, are Islamic in nature, 10% are extreme right-wing. The definition of extreme right-wing is also poorly defined." And then he noticed the problem with Prevent is that only 22% of their referrals in the last year were Islamic in nature. The majority were mixed, mental health, unknown ideology, etc. And any time he wanted to introduce the concept of ideology leading to terrorism to someone at the Home Office, they recoiled and they got a bit squishy about it. But extreme right-wing referrals were 25%. So there were 10% of open cases, 25% referrals. And so you might be thinking, okay, well, if there's fewer terrorist cases and higher numbers of referrals, it must mean that the Prevent program's working, right? They're de-radicalizing people. Well, what were they monitoring people for? Well, as questions in the House of Lords ended up unveiling, and as works by Douglas Murray and The Spectator have detailed, they had a list of texts that they had identified had overlap with extreme right-wing circles. They called these patriotic and proud texts. Ooh, how evil. These included watching Michael Portillo's Great British Railway Journeys, the BBC series, reading 1984 and Brave New World, reading C.S. Lewis, reading The Lord of the Rings, reading Beowulf. So all of those things are going to turn you into, I don't know, the Waffen-SS, apparently, according to the Home Office, which we're, as young men, net contributors to the economy, paying increasing amount of tax to ensure that these civil servants are all being paid to do. Yeah.
Sounds outrageous. It sounds almost like you're missing out some context. That's how ridiculous it seems.
The context I would apply here,
yeah,
as reported in April by my good friend Stephen Edgington for GB News, from a Home Office source, is that there is a 700-strong Home Office Islamic network who work to recruit Muslim staff and advance Muslim interests as part of their charter. Now, there is no comparable Christian network. There is no British Interests network. There shouldn't be, by the way, because you should, according to the Civil Service Charter, be completely neutral. Now, there's no such thing as a neutral institution. As we work, people have ideas, people fill institutions, ideas fill institutions. But you should at least be working in the national interest rather than all of these sectarian identity groups. But I just can't help but wonder, when Prevent stops monitoring many Islamic terrorists and lets people like Abi Harbi Ali, who killed MP Sir David Amess, slip through the net after one meeting with no follow-up, and yet obsessively monitors people who read Douglas Murray's books and call them extreme right-wing, I can't help but notice that there might be some bias at play here. That might be the context which helps understand this.
What do you think would happen if there were 700 Christians?
I think they'd actually give a lot fairer hearing to the other religions as well. And I think that they would have a lot stronger moral foundation for being able to spot actual radicalism. What I think should be done with that is you should get a broad spectrum of academics to properly define these terms if this program is to exist at all. I would gut a lot of the Home Office because a lot of civil servants are useless. I don't know if you saw Jeremy Clarkson down at the farmers' protest arguing Victoria Derbyshire, and she said, well, if not the farmers, where are we going to get all this money to pay for the NHS? Bear in mind the farm tax is only going to pay for 1 day of NHS spending. So it's the most least cost-effective enterprise in the world. But he said, see that building over there? If you can't explain to me what someone's job is, sack them. And I think that's very clever. So I'd apply that principle to the Home Office first. But then, if we're going to have a de-radicalisation programme, I'm not going to tell the government to obsess about Andrew Tate saying mean words on the internet. What I'm going to tell them to worry about is clearly defined definitions of Nazism, communism, which they don't monitor because they said anti-communist beliefs are indicative of being far-right, and properly defined Islamism, because many times when you go through all these documents, as the one that I referenced by Sarah Khan that came out this week, when you go through all these documents, when it says extreme Islamism, they name some groups which are prescribed, like Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't refer to the core texts where they get their justifications because they don't want to draw continuity between the original texts and people that take them a little bit too seriously for fear of being called racist, or because they themselves are Muslims and don't want to admit that, unfortunately, some people infer from the text a justification for violence. I think we just need to be more honest, more transparent, and a little bit more intellectually robust rather than relying on whatever activists want to get done.
How do you see this developing over the next few years as the children of the algorithm grow up? Do you see a lot of this political situation actually switching over, or do you see it getting worse?
I think America does provide a bit of hope, because what we saw leading up to the American election was a prediction of a 50-point gender gap, where young men were something like 11 to 16 points in favor of Trump, and women were swinging over 30 points for Harris. And what ended up manifesting was actually Harris lost 11 points of young women 18 to 30 from Biden, if we're to take the 2020 election numbers as the most safe and secure in history, because we're on YouTube, we will. Young men voted as a majority for Trump. That was, I think, 53% of all white men when it was majority for Biden before, a large plurality of Hispanic men, and even a third of black men who traditionally vote for Democrats. This is why Obama sort of sheepishly was standing around saying, well, the brothers aren't voting for Kamala Harris. It's like, yeah, because she's insufferable and thick. And actually, Trump is embodying a sort of masculine vitalism, and he's an avatar of Americanism. This is why even someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who I happen to notice is getting a bit more libertarian as he's been working out and doing jiu-jitsu, said, yeah, even if you don't like Trump, it's undeniable the moment he stood up after his ear was nearly blown off and he was nearly killed by Matthew Thomas Crooks, he stood up and he pumped his fist in the air and said, fight, fight, fight. That was badass. Yeah, it was. So the more figures you have like that, the more, let's say, great men of history who step into the moment, take up the mantle of leadership and say the things that need to be said despite the consternation of the mainstream media and all the chattering of the children of the algorithm. The more you have that, the more you have people demonstrating competence and solving the physical and tangible problems as they continue to get worse, as well as they did in America, as they're doing here. I think you're going to get a large cohort of young men our age that are going to take the initiative and say, yep, I'm going to vote for that guy. And hopefully they'll bring, like the people out of Egypt, more young women and young non-white guys along with them. Hopefully that cuts through all of the algorithmic noise.
We've glossed over it a couple times, and I think it's important that we actually drill into this gender bifurcation that's going on. Can you talk a little bit more about why that's happening?
I think it's rooted in the various technological revolutions we had for the last couple of centuries. So to condense this down, Ivan Illich has a very good book on this called Gender, which is that before the industrial and sexual revolutions, we didn't have to question our gender roles. They were just facts of life. You'd divide the work up based on your physical abilities. Men would tend to the cows, women would tend to the chickens, women would do the fabric weaving because you could have a baby resting on your knee. Men would go out and deal with carrying the hay bales around. And that's just what being a man and a woman meant. That's what it still means in rural African tribes. This is why, if anyone's seen What is a Woman by Matt Walsh, when he goes to the the Kenyan tribesman and says, what about your gender roles? What about non-binary? They just look quizzical and laugh at him because they've never thought to question it, because it is just how they live. As soon as work became mechanized and men or women or even children, because their hands were smaller, could do certain jobs, that meant that suddenly you had to consciously embody being a man or a woman. It's tied up with the birth rate discourse as well, because the moment you become a sort of rational economic actor with your own independent career and you're on your own life path and you're sort of working out how do I make the most of my own potential, the moment you have to rationally plan how to get married, how to have a child, how to sacrifice your economic potential in order to go through these stages of life, it becomes a lot more difficult than if it's just thrust upon you by circumstances and it's just part of the natural pattern of life. And so, as men and women have gotten the more same economically, they've gotten the more same... They've competed for these same resources and opportunities, so they've become more... It's more like the sibling economy. Rather than being complementary constituents of the same household working together to meet needs for your own children, making sacrifices and appreciating one another's role, you're less like Adam and Eve and you're more like Cain and Abel. You're bickering. If you get in the relationship, it feels a bit incestuous. And so you can't justify taking the time out of your life to trust someone else and make sacrifices in order to settle down and have a family. And so if the cultural default is that you're just two interchangeable, sort of like blank slate people who don't fit together like jigsaw puzzles, then you're not going to understand the nuances of one another's differences, which are still there because sex-based differences are real. And so rather than think of them as endearing, you're going to think of them as confusing, frustrating, and you're going to start stepping on one another's toes culturally. This is what toxic masculinity is. It's the differences in personality of competent, disagreeable men that I don't like. That's all that is. And so when you give that institutional power, because you're aiming at women's equal participation in the workforce, their equal earnings, their equal freedoms, which is basically saying they want to be like men on a biological and economic and thought-based level and eliminate all sex differences, then suddenly men are the problem, because men are the ones that are refusing to acquiesce to this new regime of equality. And so I think that's where a lot of the gender differences are coming from. Lots of young women, as fed by algorithms, are being told men are at fault. This is why you can't earn as much. This is why you're unsafe when you're walking alone at night on the streets, as if the default assumption is you get to have absolutely everything you want and you never get attacked by the worst sort of people. And so, because you're blaming men, and because you don't accept that there are deep inbuilt ineradicable differences between men and women, it becomes adversarial rather than sort of negotiation relationship. And so the cultural default is just, especially as men and women are having more broken homes and dads aren't in the home, so you can't see a model of positive masculinity. Men and women understand each other less, and so they constantly misinterpret one another's behaviours as being at fault for one another's misery.
Well, you see this in London. I think by the time you reach age 15, you have a 50% chance of growing up in a single parent home. How do you see that fueling this divide between men and women, and actually going past that, just fueling the fire that's burning in Western civilization as a whole? It feels like maybe people speak about certain elements like lack of male role models leading to a crisis of masculinity, but I think it potentially leads to a lot more than just that.
I think you're right. So to understand the role of the family as the foundation for a stable society, you have to understand how the original nation states were formed. So the states of antiquity, which were basically city sizes, they were just a collection of tribes. Tribes were a collection of families who married into one another. Families were a fundamentally religious institution, because what you would do is you would bury the ancestors in the earth, and then you would worship them at mealtime. So you'd pour out offerings to them. And so you'd act in the spirit of, this is the land that my fathers and forefathers settled. I have a duty of obligation to take care of it, to defend it to my death. If I lose the city, it means the gods have abandoned me and I have been cast out from their grace, and I should have kids to bequeath it off onto my own children. And so this is what acts of ancestor worship are. We still retain that a little bit anytime we do an Armistice Day service. Because think about how we go to the cenotaph, we lay a wreath down, we pay our respects for the young men who fought and died for us to preserve our freedoms, or whatever the common parlance is now, but basically our way of life. They fought and died so that their children could live as they wanted them to live. This was the foundation of a city-state. It was families who worshipped their ancestors, who came together, who intermarried to ensure they had the same ancestors, who worshipped the same heroes. And so to be a citizen was to have the religion of the state because your fathers built the place. Okay, if you destroy the family, you destroy the nation because you no longer have a tie to who built it, who maintains the culture. You no longer have an appreciation for the family structure. You can no longer justify having your own kids because you don't pass seamlessly from child to adolescent to adult to fitting the mold that your father filled in your own household. And often, because nature abhors a vacuum, young men, and this is broken down by ethnic demographic because the sort of 50% range skews heavily, unfortunately, towards Black and Caribbean kids in this country, heavily towards Black Americans in the US. Young men will go looking for father figures and they'll find it in older boys, and they'll often join gangs, and they'll often get involved in gang violence, and they might get involved in drugs in order to make some sort of entrepreneurial thing. And I say this with a bit of, let's say, peripheral experience, because I went to a Southeast London school, went to a state school, and two of the kids in my class, one of them was kicked to death in the street by a drug dealer. Again, young black guy. I don't know to what extent his dad was involved, but believe it was only his mum that gave the eulogy. And another guy, his dad died, I believe, young mixed race guy. His older brother got into selling drugs. He started laundering it, and he was arrested by the police and sent to prison. Basically gave up a very lucrative career in sports because he had a scholarship to go abroad and play football. Life was completely ruined because the moment his dad disappeared, that sense of meaning and mentorship vanished, and he attached himself to an unsuitable figure. So if you destroy the family, you destroy the chain upon which culture and gratitude is passed down. So if this breakup of families continues to get worse, then the deleterious effects will continue to parcel through civilization.
It's funny, we have an easy time understanding the concept, at least, of a God-shaped hole, but we never speak about a father-shaped hole. How do you think the government can go about legislatively fixing this issue? Are there any low-hanging fruits that we can pick straight away?
There's quite a few. So I think the government can get out of the way of actively destroying the culture and enforcing, let's say, unilateral multicultural standards on us.
What do you mean by that?
So, as already mentioned, the Home Office uses psychological programs to make regular Brits accept the cultures of newcomers. And so it's a bit like Eric Kaufman writes this in a book called White Shift, a very good book on immigration. What they do with multiculturalism is they say, your country is hosting the World Fair. Everyone gets a booth, except you. So just be happy that you have the fair rather than your own booth. And this is the message that's being conveyed. So if the government just stops actively conveying this message using the likes of Raiku and Prevent and all these speeches about how diversity makes Britain strong, we can have our own cohesive culture. Our own cohesive culture would be, hopefully, traditionally, the culture which led to our peace and prosperity and flourishing, which is how an Englishman thinks he should live his life, with liberty, with prosperity, with peace and politeness, but also a bit of Christianity sprinkled in. And I know people are going to recoil at that, but that's a topic for later, I'm sure. As far as turning the dials on economic incentives, the Hungarians have done some interesting stuff. The Hungarians have said, you get a loan. If you're a couple that marries before the age of 30, you get a large loan. For every child you have, 25% of the loan is written off. So if you have 4 children, the loan is completely written off. Now, they're spending about 5% of GDP on this. Very expensive, but if you eliminated stupid and costly climate commitments, lots of foreign aid to countries who hate us, and the money we spend on battery farming foreign nationals in social housing and asylum accommodation, we might be able to make it, and it would be a much more sound investment. They've also said to women, if you have children, for each child you have, 25% of income tax will be knocked off for life. So that means that by the time that you have raised your kids and grown up, if you're running a little business on the side, or you decide to go work full time, you're never going to pay income tax again. So you get a second lease on life the moment that your kids have left to go to university and had children of their own. It has upticked the birth rate very slightly, because pretty much everywhere in the world is now sub-replacement birth rate, other than some countries in Africa.
I feel like I saw somewhere that it upticked by 0.1%.
It was about 0.2, but the encouraging metrics for the long term is that divorces have halved, abortions have more than halved, marriages have more than doubled. And that was during lockdown, where every single other country in Europe all of those metrics were flatlining and decreasing. So that's encouraging. But on the cultural point being just as important as the economic point, I also would like to rule out daycare, by the way, because daycare is a terrible thing for kids. Raises their average blood cortisol level throughout their life, makes them more likely to have mental health issues. And you're not going to encourage people who want kids to have more kids by saying, here, at an earlier age, you can get paid to stick them in government daycare and you can go back to work making widgets and contributing to GDP. Point being, the Israelis don't have to do the same measures that the Hungarians do, but they have higher GDP per capita, so they're not suffering these economic problems. They've got thriving religious culture, they've got thriving sort of sense of national identity, and they've got a high birth rate. They're about the only modern developed country that have a above replacement birth rate, and it's trending up because there are certain Orthodox sects who have like 8 kids on average, but even secular Jews there who don't believe in the tenets of Judaism, they live there, and because having children is just normal to them, it's sort of high status thing, they end up having more than the replacement level, which is 2.1 children per woman as well. So there's something about the cultural default being having kids is a good thing, it's the default standard, and if you're a young person, having other young people having kids around you that makes it normal, so having your first is not as big a leap. There's something about that that primes people for it, no matter how much money you want to put at them.
Should we really be looking at the lessening divorces happening because of these incentives? Surely maybe someone would push back on you and say that they've just lessened because there are incentives for people not to do that, when actually, truly, if it was more convenient and accessible, they would take that divorce and it would be the right option for them. Would it not be more productive to look at the things like the initiation of having kids, which has barely upticked?
It's going to take some time, just because people, when they get married, lots of them want to be situated. There's still housing problems that they haven't overcome. Housing problems are also a lot worse here. That's something else we can get into. But I'd also say about divorce, there seems to be an intractable problem with how we talk about divorce. We haven't had no-fault divorce in this country for very long. I think that was only introduced under the Conservatives. Most people think about divorce in the American context, which has had no-fault divorce for a very long time. The problem with divorce is that it is always framed in a way that leads to, again, what's good for the individual. It's, we have irreconcilable differences, I married the wrong partner, it's not working out, I'm going to leave. Katie Faust is very good on this. She runs a charity called Them Before Us, and it's a child-centric worldview. And she always says, who is the person who has the least say in a household that's breaking down? It's the child. They didn't choose their parents, so what a child has to do is suffer on behalf of what the parents want as atomized individuals because they made the wrong choices. Instead, if you're a parent, you should be thinking, because this kid didn't choose me, I should act as if they could have chosen me, they would have. So that means I have to live up to the bar of, they would choose me above all other parents if they could. Therefore, I should act in such a way that keeps my family together, and I should choose a partner that is proper enough that I would want to stay with them. And so, yes, financial incentives can help encourage marriages, etc., but you need a robust enough culture that cultivates people of moral virtue so that when they come together, they don't immediately think, right, there's no consequences for just tearing this bond asunder. It matters no more than just an economic transaction because it's good for the tax rates, right? This is what I think the Israelis do quite well, even though I'm not Jewish. And also the Hungarians with, let's say, their rising levels of Christianity after the Soviet Union. This is what they're getting a recognizance of. A good cultural example actually Georgia. I think if you have over 3 children in Georgia, the country, not the American state, the Archbishop himself will come and baptize your baby. Because Christianity is still very prevalent there, that makes it a high status thing. So you need to lean into the sort of cultural high statusness to incentivize marriage between good people, discourage divorce, encourage having kids, ensure that the culture is passed on generations.
It is terrifying looking at this depopulation bomb that's going off. And the weirdest part is seeing this rise in online anti-natalists who are saying that we're overpopulated and that it's evil to have kids. What do you make to that movement?
So I think it's fundamentally inhuman because if you look at most of the polling, the majority of young men and young women say that they want more than 2 kids. I think it was the New Social Covenant Foundation found late last year that 92% of women 18 to 30 in the UK said they wanted 2 to 3 children.
Well, people don't want to have less kids. It's just less people are having kids as a whole.
Yes, quite. And we've now reached 50% of women age 30 in the UK who have not had children, which by my friend demographer Stephen Shaw's calculations mean that 50% of that 50% will never have children because they might not meet the right person in time. So they're going to succumb to something he calls unplanned childlessness. So about 25% of our total generation is never going to have kids, even though they wanted them. It's only about 10% of people that don't want kids ever. And those people, again, lots of it is fed to them by social media algorithms. They've fallen for the lie that human beings are unconscionable consumers of nature and the climate, and it should be left as a sacrifice to the sun god or something. Or there are people that say human beings don't consent to be born, therefore it's evil to inflict upon them something they didn't consent to. It's ultimate brain rot of liberal morality, clearly. But I think it's actually a less conscious thing than that. I think for the people that think they're choosing not to have kids, the unspoken truth is, again, if you have a broken family, you can't justify family. And I think a lot of people that don't want to have those kids have come from very broken and traumatizing homes, so they can't see the value in becoming parents themselves because their lives as children was so poor. And so I don't think, unless you're willing to address the multifaceted forms of child abuse in civilization, you're going to convince those people rationally.
Well, I find this a very difficult conversation to navigate, especially having grown up in Brighton and sort of being this nominal wokey.
You poor sod.
Yeah, I did a video recently interviewing women of all ages in public about feminism. And in between these interviews, I did a little piece to camera speaking about this feminism and about this depopulation. And it's a very hard circle for me to square because ultimately, it seems to me, as a nominal wokey that's grown up embedded in these ideologies, that a lot of it does come down to our attitude towards men and women, obviously, and what they do a la their careers, and at what point they sacrifice a career for raising a family. But it's tricky because I also don't want to put out a message, and I wouldn't feel right without pushing back on you about this, that we need to be careful that we don't just tell women to have babies, stay at home and make a sandwich, because that's very much a straw man argument that the far left would make. But I think in some senses it is a valid one, because there is a slippery slope of going from telling women to have more kids and sacrifice their careers and sort of think about that carefully to saying that's all that they're good for.
I think, if I remember correctly, Miriam Cates, who just left Parliament because of the election, but she was sadly one of the casualties of the Conservative Party's appalling reputation. She was one of the good ones. She did some work on this, and she found from her polling that about a third of women want to just stay home full-time and have kids. A third of women want to go straight back to work after they have kids, and a third of women want a split. So the problem is, why is the economy not set up in such a way as to facilitate those choices? Because I might have moral quandaries with saying, handing your kids off straight away to a daycare worker just so you can go back and fill in spreadsheets, and I'm being mean here, but I might say that's not best for the child. We can prove that empirically. We can say morally the child doesn't get a say in that, whereas you do, so your duty should be to the child. But okay, let's say there's a plurality of desires here. Why is the economy only set up to encourage women to go straight back to work? Because what the government is legislating for is, under Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, again, Conservative, he said, we're going to start doing daycare from 6 months onwards. Now, in many instances, it's illegal to take away puppies from their mothers at a certain age, but it's not for babies. There's no such legislation in the US where babies from weeks old are being given over to daycare while their mums go back because they can't afford to do so. Why are we in that situation? Well, it's because as a civilization, and this is part of the reason men and women are so antagonistic, we don't value anything we can't calculate on a spreadsheet. So if the modus operandi of the state is just to increase GDP, not GDP per capita so we're each getting richer, but GDP so the balance sheet just looks good, you get in the position where if you are spending more and growing less, the economy must intrude on increasing domains of private life. Back in old civilizations, there was no real distinction between public and private because the state was an extension of the family. But ever since the Enlightenment, we've got public, private, big distinction. The state shouldn't impede on my private liberty. Well, if the state only has the interests of growing the wealth pie, then it needs to start making more of the private sphere a money transaction. So, what's the monetary benefit of a mum staying home and taking care of her kids? Well, you might get a more informed, more civic participated set of kids. You might get more kids in the future. And so 20 years down the line, we'll have great economic benefits. But our election cycle is only 5 years. So what do? Oh, and also we've got these neutral bodies like the OBR and the Bank of England that tell us we need to do economic modelling every single year. So we're on a year time frame here. Right, okay. What we do is we make a job out of parenting. So we ensure that the state will subsidise someone else to take care of your kids. So you get the money, you earn, you pay it in tax, the money comes back to you, you then hand the money to someone else, they're taxed on that money, it goes back to the state, and see, more economic transactions are happening, therefore more money's flowing, therefore the GDP is growing, even though it's not serving the interests of the women who want to take care of their kids, the kids who want to see their mums, and also, this is another conversation, the broader civilization who is now going to need to import lots of people who don't share the culture in to do these jobs that the government has created. So basically, it's not really serving anyone.
The common thread with all of this that I see going on is that we're looking at things that are quantitative rather than qualitative. And it feels like there's this culture, whether it's even something as trivial as getting into the self-improvement space, everything is very cerebral and calculated. And I was speaking to Glenn Scrivener about this. I was sort of playing the role of the young agnostic that I am, who's grown up amongst atheists, and he was playing the role of the Christian pastor that he is. And we were speaking about how sometimes you have to zoom out past looking at things just in this lens of science. And, you know, sometimes there is a worth to just living through things and actually seeing how things turn out.
Okay, let me get so far out of the realm of science that I lose people and see if I can bring people back.
Go for it.
Modern culture is like a demon. It acts on people and pushes them along a life path as if it has a will of its own. But it's just the sum total of human activity. There's a Polish occultist who uses the term egregore. And the egregore is like a composite intelligence that acts as if it has a will of its own, but is just a product of a lot of people acting according to the incentives of the system. The best example of this is how Twitter is meant to be a system to share information, increase the sum total of human knowledge. Now, when you get a bunch of people together and have an open dialogue, what happens? It drives journalists mental. It's like a lunatic asylum. So it seems to act against its own stated purpose. The same thing with dating apps. I did an article for The Critic a little while ago on this. Now, I will have this as the proviso of dating apps is one of those technologies that you can actually use in spite of its own perverse incentives, because after writing this article, I then met my missus and I'm getting married next year. Anyway, point being, I am a hypocrite. Dating apps promise infinite options that you can meet your perfect person. What instead they do is they suspend commitment with the hypothetical promise that the perfect person is out there. And so they encourage you and everyone else to commodify yourselves and get on this carousel of infinite validation while never actually settling. So despite promising to lead you to your perfect relationship, it's actually led to fewer relationships. And when you speak about the economy and it sort of economizing more things of people's private lives, what's happening is it's pushing people down the life path, which is not necessarily conducive to their own interests. So if people are spending more of their lives making and consuming products or getting into wellness, which is another good idea, the sort of Sigma male grind set meme, right? Lionizing Patrick Bateman, even though he's a deeply unhealthy person. If people are spending more time doing what Illich would call shadow work, which is working and then coming home and treating their life like a job so they maximally recuperate in order to go back and be maximally productive when they go back to work, then are you living for you? Or are you living in the service of something else, almost like an abstract entity, which is acting with its own will to accumulate goods to ensure that you don't reproduce and have more human connections, who is replacing human labor with non-human labor for the sake of efficiency? Point being, if we're removing the human element from all of our culture, who's actually serving if it's not humans? So that is a very, let's say, non-rational, non-enlightenment way of looking at things, but it's at least a useful analogy. And the problem, as you said, is the scientific, very materialistic, very rational worldview, because fundamentally the lie is that we're rational animals. We're not. Like, the animal part often wins out. We go through the motions, we do our habits, we have very sentimental attachments to things that we can't rationally justify. And to put the burden of rational justification on someone for their family or even their religion to an extent, I think that's wrong, because you're strip mining all the things that make life incredibly meaningful and that puts you on the path that gives you structure to go through these initiation rituals into a culture, into a family, into a hierarchy, for the sake of saying we have to have it so that it fits perfectly according to this thought experiment as the Enlightenment dictates, because we're enlightened, secular, rational people. And it's like, well, if you're doing that and people end up more miserable, it makes me think of the villain from No Country for Old Men. If the rule you followed has led you to this point, what use was the rule? And I think we've made a lot of mistakes since the 1700s, and I think it's probably time to reevaluate.
Well, in relation to the point of the egregores, I read a great article by Mary Harrington the other day.
She's a very good friend of mine. She's very good.
Yeah, and she speaks about it as well in relation to this dopamine loop that we're facing online. And we've outlined it at the start, this problem of social media and the reactionary Gen Z that you're going to face. And she says, the more immediate and dopamine-laden the relation between a content creator and his or her audience, the more intense the temptation to be shaped by, to be, as it were, created as content by that audience. And she was speaking in relation to Lily Phillips shagging 101 men in one day.
I can't believe I'm talking about this. I have tried to avoid this discourse. I have muted her name on my time because everyone has a take on this, but all right, fine, let's go for it. Yes. So first of all, the thing to say about this girl is, from what I understand it, from my very irate female friends who keep texting me about this, is that her parents are basically pimping her out. They run her accounts on social media, and so they seem completely apathetic to what is happening to their daughter. Yes. But this is a very extreme example of audience capture. I think that's actually quite a good reading of it. And this is why my advice to people who spend their day on the internet, this is the difference between people that are led by algorithms versus people that take up the tools and cultivate it for themselves. I won't quote the famous Tyler, the Creator quote back because it will get me cancelled, but don't read the comments, go outside, shut your eyes and turn off your phone. I like to use things like Twitter as I pull the pin on a grenade, I drop it, the take sits there, it explodes, and I am well far from the blast zone, and so I'm never caught in the direct vicinity. But this Lily Phillips example is a great idea where if you economize your entire life and make even the most intimate possible acts into content, you are led to believe that you can divorce yourself from the consequences in order to chase the validation and economic highs of being one of the most famous people online. And I'm not encouraging people to watch what I assume is a sordid documentary that I've seen all of a 1 minute clip out of. But the famous 1 minute clip that's going around.
When was the last time you ate?
I think I had a yum yum, and I think I had a sandwich, and that was and then the rest. It's not for the weak, girls, if I'm honest. It was hard. I don't know if I'd recommend it.
Why not?
I think if you're a different type of girl, it's very it's kind of like being a prostitute in a sense of it's just a different feeling. I don't know how to explain it,
It's not like just having sex with someone.
Yeah. Just one in, one out, it feels intense.
More intense than you thought it might.
Definitely.
I would urge people to ask, judging by her face, is trading your soul and your integrity and your ability to look at yourself in the mirror every morning without remembering what you have done to yourself worth it for social media likes and a few extra figures in your bank account? Because I would assert not, and I would assert that people who knew fewer people in the past, cared less about the opinions of others, and had less money to hand, had more fulfilling and meaningful lives by just being normal and having kids. That would be my advice. Get off the internet and stop chasing dopamine.
Yeah, this is a bit of a tangent, but I've done a lot of work out in Saudi Arabia the last year. I've been 4 times. And the key difference I've seen with the guys over there that I speak to is that there's not this same sense of wanting to do something for the short-term status gain. That has been completely severed from their society, because in their culture, pleasing your family is way more important. And that's the big shift that I see with our generation in the West, is that fuck being a doctor, I want to be a social media influencer, because that gains the most notoriety of not just my immediate family and friends, but the entire world. And I've got 10 million followers. Most of them are bots, and most of them are just following me because of my abs or arse or whatever you're posting. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's very much still got that culture of passing down the family business and wanting to do your family name proud. Whereas as soon as you get rid of that and you open yourself up to this world and wanting to please as many people as possible, you're no longer going to provide value. You're just providing what looks flashiest on the surface, but is fundamentally cracked underneath.
Yeah. I will add an extra full stop to that prior rant and say ban porn. I will not elaborate. But point being, I'll take that point to my domain, which is politics. So there is a building momentum outside traditional political parties in Britain, and people are going to, ahead of the 2029 election, look for fresh-faced, informed potential political candidates. And the problem you get is that if you've grown up on the internet and you've had no restrictions placed on what you can and can't say, one of two things will happen. Either one, internet natives will seem unpredictable and untrustworthy to people of the older generation who are trying to run a particularly traditional political campaign. And so there will always be a cancelable tweet somewhere. So some of even the best people will be deselected or knocked off the candidate list. Or if they're particularly good at message discipline and they're very good in the public sphere and they're good on camera and all that, why would they take a substantial pay cut or a cap to their ability to crowdsource self-esteem or accrue opportunities by going and sitting in a parliamentary office and outsourcing most of their research to 3 poorly paid spads who aren't as bright as them? And so what you've got really is social media being an excellent mechanism for upstart political parties to gain new support and bring in new younger voters who are disenfranchised with the likes of the BBC or Conservative and Labour binary. But in order to recruit people to actually stand for election in those parties, social media is kneecapping you, because the most bright and enterprising and free-thinking and free-spoken spirits there are going to use social media rather than the traditional political parties to get their point out. So I am very interested to see how this gets navigated in the future.
I love that we're discussing all these different problems facing Gen Z, and we're sort of going through one by one with a few weaves. What else would you say is a biggest problem that we should be concerned about?
Demographics. We've touched upon it with the birth rate discourse, but the other side of the birth rate coin is immigration. And so when I went to school, as I've already mentioned, there were a couple of kids who got into serious legal, even fatal trouble. But the majority of people were law-abiding, not too troublesome. It wasn't like Grange Hill or Waterloo Road or anything like that. But I did have a very diverse class. And again, on an individual level, loads of these kids are great. Like, I've seen some of the African kids that I went to school with independently years after we've left school. And even though we weren't that close, there was really nice guys always come and see me. They're like, oh, great, I heard about your career. Hey, I'm in banking now and I'm doing cool, really good. But in aggregate, if you have very diverse student cohorts, what you get is tribalism. Because what you would get is the African kids having banter about one another, depending on which country they come from. And then they would form a block of African kids who would mock the Caribbean kids. And the African Caribbean kids would say, hey, we're the black kids. We won't sit with the white kids, or the Asian kids, or the Indian kids. And so you get sort of ethnic factionalism that comes to the forefront, whether you like it or not.
Why?
I think human nature is just tribal. I don't think it's sort of learned institutional racism. I don't even think it's particularly hostile. I think it's just people naturally gravitate towards what's familiar. They gravitate to what feels like their family. That's fine. That's totally fine. My issue is when culture and the government then tell you, this is racist, this is inferior, this is superior. I'm happy to just let people self-associate and be friends with who they want to be friends with. But what I think is more diverse age group is a kind of lifting the veil on human nature. And so this puts light to the lie that we are all blank slates with completely swappable historical, familial, cultural baggage, that if you just pluck an entire group of people from here and you drop them here and you let them pass through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, suddenly, because they've got a passport, they're as British as you and me. That's just clearly not the case. Because if you look at second, third, fourth generation immigrants, they often identify with their parents' host culture. Again, understandable, but then to pretend like this isn't going to present any cultural conflicts is an absurd way to manage a civilization. And so what you're going to get is what Robert Putnam warned about in Bowling Alone in the early 2000s, where increasingly diverse societies only see two metrics going up. TV watching, which means you're staying at home, consuming your own content, and you're increasingly atomized, which has only been made worse through social media, and protest marches, which we see bloody constantly for whatever the omnicause has fed to the algorithms of people on that given day. And so you're going to see an increasing tribalization. Now, again, I think tribalism is the sort of natural state of human beings, because if the city and the nation is an extension of the family, then you're going to be very tribal about the place that your ancestors helped settle. But then, if you're taught that the other people you're living in a civilization with are prejudiced against you and have robbed you of something somehow with the myths of white privilege or the myths of toxic masculinity or the myths of cis heteronormative patriarchy, whatever the word they invent these days that you can't bloody spell, then you're going to deepen and worsen those antagonisms when they don't need to be the case. And the issue you have is that people can only talk about these things unilaterally. Again, I'll use a political example for people who aren't as deep in the weeds here. So Kemi Badenoch has just been elected the new Conservative leader. For those who don't know, Kemi Badenoch in her maiden speech identified as a first-generation immigrant because her mum flew over from Nigeria. She had her in an NHS hospital in Wimbledon. She flew back to Nigeria and they lived in America for a bit. And then Kemi came over age 16 to study and work in the UK. And she's lived in the UK since. She's married an English man. I think he's Scottish, actually. Anyway, point being. But she identifies as a first-generation immigrant, even though she was born here. She then lobbied to increase immigration because she said, as a first-generation immigrant, I want more immigrants. So she feels a kinship with the class immigrant, even though there's all different ethnicities and cultures and religions. And so there's deep divisions between the people who were born, raised, and live here and people who have just come here. That's going to be a conflict. Now, if you, as, let's say, a native-born Englishman, say, part of my identity as an Englishman is ethnic, as in it's derived because my family, my parents, my grandparents helped build this country. Same claim that the black Americans use, and Americans say, I'm an American because my ancestors built this country whether or not I can vote. Completely legitimate. If you say that, you are persona non grata in politics. I said that on GB News, and I had a Labour MP, former Labour MP, tear what few remaining hairs out he had, and the clip got hundreds of thousands of views and started an absolute outrage for a single day. Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservative Party, said in The Spectator yesterday, in an interview with her mentor Michael Gove, that she's not Nigerian, she's Yoruba, a particular ethnic group in a particular place in Nigeria, and the other ethnic groups in Nigeria are her, quote, ethnic enemies. So, if newly imported ethnic groups think that way, and that's a sort of intractable way they think about themselves, they strongly identify with the ethnicity, the culture, the religion of the homeland, it's obviously going to present barriers of integration and shared culture with people that were born and raised here, whose family have been here for a long time. And so if you tell the people who live in Britain, you can't think that way, but you tell the new arrivals, some of them who have never even visited their parents' homelands, you can absolutely think that way, and it's a good thing, actually, because diversity is our strength, then you're going to get cultural wars. I don't want constant ethnic battles, but I don't see how the current order manages that.
Can you flip this to maybe an example using another country and us Brits coming over to them? Because I think it's very difficult for people to hear all of this talk about immigration, and especially being 19, it's one of these things that we just nominally accept you being a bigot because you depose mass migration and uncontrolled migration. Is there maybe a way of putting it in a framing that highlights the problem with us if we went over to another culture, for example?
I could do a couple. First of all, if anyone has grandparents that have moved over to Spain and immediately demand a British pub be set up in Spain and they don't speak Spanish and they cause trouble for the locals by drinking all day, then people would turn around and go, oh yeah, the Spanish should kick them out straight back to England and Benidorm should go back to being all Spanish again. Yeah, completely agree. Okay, I think we should apply the same principle at home. The same goes, and I like using this example because, of course, the reason why every European country is obsessed with not being seen as racist is because of the Second World War, and nobody wants to run a repeat of that again because, of course, the atrocities of the Holocaust, incredibly bad. Nobody ever wants to see it again. But if you've noticed, nobody on even, let's say, the liberal right is demanding more diverse and inclusive forms of Zionism when Israel defends itself. So everyone acknowledges that Israel would stop being Israel if it stopped being majority Israeli. And so if Britain stopped being majority British, as in the indigenous populations here, not just people who have passports or swear fealty to British values like it's a Scout's pledge, if Britain stops being majority British, does it stop being British? I'll leave people with one final rule. We've all heard the phrase British values, or Christian values in the sense that Richard Dawkins talks about, even though he doesn't want to be a Christian. Whenever you hear the word values, whatever comes before it, the person who is saying it is not that thing. So if you're saying British values, it is because we have reached the point where people are no longer instinctively identifying as British, and so they have to rote learn the culture like it's some sort of creed. The same thing with gender roles. The reason we're trying to re-examine how men and women fit together is because it's no longer ergonomic to us. It's no longer natural. Or it's the same thing with Christian values. The reason Richard Dawkins is saying he's a cultural Christian is because he's realised he has spent about 30 years scaring absolutely everyone out of the pews until it starts to resemble Philip Larkin's poem Churchgoing. And then he's like, oh, I'm surrounded suddenly by really intolerant Islamists who have stabbed my friend Salman Rushdie. And they're not really interested in talking to me. Maybe I should convince everyone to be Christians, but without the Christianity again. It's like, that's not going to work. So we need to have this conversation about how values, culture, is connected to people, connection of families that have founded the country. And by having that conversation, we might be able to overcome all of these cultural divisions that we're seeing more prevalent in our age bracket just by the kinds of groups we go to school with.
I'd love to navigate through a few more issues that we're facing as a generation, but first, just to tie a ribbon on this section, I was scrolling and I saw a video of your appearance on Andrew Gold, and I think the thumbnail was something along the lines of racial communism. And it was actually something that I'd come to the conclusion about myself from having a candid chat with my mum in the kitchen and just working out the logical conclusions of things and ignoring all the noise, just looking at things on a first principles basis. And to me, the logical conclusion, and I'll be honest, I'm wincing and I'm fucking terrified speaking about this because I never speak about this and I've grown up where it's frowned upon to even question these things. But that's the point of this show. So here we go. The logical conclusion of mass uncontrolled immigration is that eventually everyone blends together into one race. If you are a big fan, if you're a big fan of Indian culture and you think it's beautiful, that's going to go if you have mass uncontrolled immigration around the whole world. No matter what the culture is, if you don't enforce these nations and borders and states, you lose individual countries' identities. And I know this might be obvious for you to hear, but I think it's something that just blew my mind actually coming to the realization of. And I think that's quite a powerful argument to someone who prides themselves on being tolerant and acceptive of all cultures. They're all going to be gone if you don't do something about that.
It's a great liquidating force. That is the aim. The aim is to turn every nation in the world into, and this is, again, borrowing from the great Mary Harrington, an airport departure lounge of where anyone from everywhere can speak the same business English language. They can wear similar clothes. They can move seamlessly without any commitment. So everything is totally voluntary. Everything's facilitated by an app. So it's all very efficient and cost effective. You've got a buffet of all sorts of different foods. So cultures are cosmetic. You can pick and choose where you like, and you've not got to commit yourself to one given thing. So it's not restricting you. And, of course, it's monitored at all times by a surveillance state that makes sure everyone plays nice. Isn't that a wonderful dream? And I say racial communism, by the way. That's what woke means. Woke is not critical social justice or Gnostic attack on... No, it's not all of this bollocks. It's gay race communism. Woke is gay race communism. That is how... It's the product of the algorithms. That's what it is. And I say race communism because people sort of get tripped up, liberals get tripped up on why the left claim to be anti-racist, but then they're really racist. They're condescending towards black people and they hate white people. It's because they are using discrimination as a procedure to level the playing field because they believe that fundamentally everyone is equal. When they say everyone is equal, they mean this. They think that before civilization existed, we were all running about in the woods and we couldn't tell each other apart. Geography, culture, economics, family structure, all these things are completely irrelevant to them. They think that these are top-down imposed tyrannies that they just need to repeal away and the scales will fall from our eyes and we'll see that we're all equal, and that's why we will all come to the same outcome, because fundamentally human nature is a blank slate. That's what they believe. And so they think if they just discriminate in the meantime, they will get us to an equal level and we'll realize, oh my God, we've been racist to each other this entire time. We're actually just all equal. We can just live like this forever now in the utopia. They're not going to get that, though. What they're going to get, as with Richard Dawkins' consternations about the Islamists, if they add all of these elements into the multicultural blender, they think of it as a melting pot. They think that they're going to add all these metals in and all the impurities will melt off like a crucible and you get this pure, wrought, incredibly strong metal out of it. It's instead a blender where they're going to add all these ingredients. They might not all be complementary flavors. And after they hit blend, the strongest, most indigestible flavor will leave a very bitter aftertaste. And that is the least liberal ideology. And that comes back to what we were discussing in the Home Office before, which is certain forms of Islam or very tribal, ethnic-based forms of clan competition that you get in the likes of Sub-Saharan Africa or in the Middle East. They won't acquiesce to these multicultural, very liberal standards. Instead, they will settle things by force, and they will very much assert themselves against the campaigns for gay rights and women's rights and whatever else you want to say. So the sorts of people that are pushing for liberal, egalitarian, tolerant values because they think they're going to get this communist utopia, you're just soaring off the branch you're sitting on, I'm afraid.
I think it's a powerful reframe to make people really question their beliefs, is that if you are this tolerant, perfect, beautiful, moral person, then these other cultures that you profess to love so much are going to go away if you strip away borders and differences. I mean, that's just obvious to me. That's first principles thinking. What's another issue facing our generation?
I'll say housing because that's connected to the immigration one, but I think it's thought about in the wrong way. So Paul Morland has a good book on this called No One Left that is criminally underread, basically on demographics and birth rates. And he points out that in different places in the country where housing rates are lower, the birth rates are not necessarily higher. And this is average rate, not per ethnic and cultural groups. Obviously, different ethnicities and different religions have more kids than others. However, I do think, speaking from experience, and I don't think that subjective anecdotal experience is a completely invalid epistemological tool. Sometimes the woke are more correct than the liberals in this one. Speaking from experience, our generation delays the date at which they become adults, practically, even if legally they are adults, by the fact that the ladder has been pulled up for their opportunity to own a home, have an independent income, then have kids after getting a secure relationship. And so the housing shortage and the overall cost of it. I mean, just trying to save for a deposit is maddening because most people can probably, with their average salary, make the average mortgage payment every month. But just trying to save up 60, 70, whatever grand to afford a house around an economic opportunity zone like London, which is the only place you can really live because it's been so centralized, is ridiculous. And then you compound that with the competition that you're facing. If you're a well-earning, law-abiding British young man or woman like you or me, you're on a car compact from top and bottom. You've got the boomer generation, which, God bless them, I love my grandparents, but because of extending life expectancy, because they bought at a cheaper time where, proportionate to their income, house prices were lower. I think it was about 3 times the average income would have got you a house, whereas now it's 11 or 12 times, depending on where you go. They have bought their properties. They've sold them on at increasingly higher prices. They've only accrued and increased their wealth. And so now they hold the majority of the property. Now, I'm not saying Marxist revolution against landowners or anything. I'm just saying we are not building enough. We're adding 1 million people to our population through immigration every year, and those people have to live somewhere. And we're now in the absurd situation where we are breaking the intergenerational chain of inherited wealth through income tax. We are having people live longer, and so there's fewer houses being freed up every year. And we now have to build a new home every 2 minutes, or 18 cities the size of Birmingham by 2046, just to accommodate new arrivals who we're saying need to fill homes, need to fill jobs, vacant jobs in the job market. And then that also creates another problem of how do you save when the taxes are at the highest rate since 1948? And that's because we have to meet pension paying commitments and NHS commitments, which we will probably never get. The pension system will probably collapse by the time we get to that age. And we are disproportionately not using healthcare unless, as a young man, you do something stupid, screw up and break your leg or something. So, an increasing amount of our income, especially if you are enterprising enough to reach above £50,000 a year, half of that gets taxed for any American viewers, by the way, is being taken to spend on social welfare programs for new arrivals and the elderly. Want to take care of my grandparents, but I don't think it's very cost effective. That is inhibiting our ability to buy a home. And so at the same time, we're paying for the upper echelon, the lower echelon, who are just coming in and getting social housing. I mean, 72% of Somalians in the UK live in social housing. 50% of social housing in London is to foreign nationals. So we're paying for that. So our money's going there, and the gap is widening because the costs of housing and the costs of living are going up because the government keeps mismanaging the economy. I mean, the reason that inflation happened, people might not know. Inflation is when the money supply exceeds the supply of goods. And it's a rate of change metric. It's not every year it's added. It's that it's relative to the last year. So if inflation went up by 10% this year and it goes up by 2% next year, it's not that it's only gone up by 12%. It's that it's gone up 2% on the inflated 12% additionally. So things are getting more expensive year on year. The reason that happened is because the government has decided to sabotage our energy sector. They decided to spend more on welfare commitments because they think that if they spend more money as a government, it grows the economy, back to the GDP argument. And during lockdowns, which confiscated our social lives, our job prospects, our university degrees, I had half of my term time for my third year and my entire master's rendered online for that, and I still paid the same amount of money in loans. They printed loads of money to sit at home, to pay people to sit at home, and that was squandered on fraudulent business loans that still haven't been paid back. So one of the worst things that's facing us is economic deprivation that we have inherited. We have been indebted before our birth, and as of yet, nobody's interested in fixing this, at least for the next 5 years.
What do you think to Rory Sutherland's slightly out there idea that the first £100,000 you earn in your life should be tax-free, flipping the model that way?
Oh, I would be incredibly draconian were I made king for a day. I would be very socially tyrannical, and then on economics, I'd be unbelievably libertarian. I'd just abolish income tax. I'd sack the majority of civil servants. I'd cut most government spending. I'd completely cut all foreign aid, and I would shrink the state down to the size where you could run the emergency services and the military and border control, and you could probably do it through voluntary donations, because most people are, if they've got loads of disposable income, going to pay for that as a kind of protection model. So that's very nice. I like the reform idea, by the way, and I've got my criticisms of reform, I've got my praises of reform, but I like the Reform UK idea, which is that they're going to lift the income tax threshold from £12,500 to £20,000 so it gets people off benefits organically. I like all these ideas, but I think they're just stepping stones on the way to rolling back what was meant to be a temporary measure to only raise money so that the king could mass his armies in the time of war, which is just getting rid of income tax entirely. I know Trump promised it with replacing it with tariffs. We'll see if the Fed will allow him to do it. But if he can do that and pioneer it and it works, well, as the 51st state of the global American empire, I'd love it if Britain could do the same thing.
So to wrap up, we've discussed a bunch of different issues facing our generation. What do you think is the biggest issue? Is it something that we've already discussed, or is it something new to this conversation?
I think it's spiritual and cultural death, because you can survive economic hardship if you have a why to sustain your how. Ironic that I'm quoting Nietzsche, who proclaimed the death of God. I think there's some encouraging signs on the horizon there, because a lot of young men, particularly in the US, are returning to traditional churches. They're not going for this sort of woolly, we have a Black Lives Matter sign out front and fly the pride flag, and we're still Christians, by the way, Presbyterianism. Lots of them going back to Catholicism, traditional Latin Mass, the Orthodox Church, and this is acting as a North Star for young men to reclaim that tradition, and hopefully to bring some young women along with them and to have wholesome relationships and to raise children with gratitude to the culture. But still the majority of people are succumbing to this cultural and spiritual malaise. They can't justify their own civilization as being better than another and worth investing in and worth sustaining with the sacrifices to have a family. At the same time, they are importing or just having fewer kids than the other countries that are practicing other incompatible beliefs with a lot of conviction. Like, there's one thing that you can't doubt the Saudis on, or even nutcases like the Iranians. They really believe in themselves, and they're not open to negotiation. So what people need to start understanding is the culture war is downstream of the spiritual war, and it is existential. You are not going to negotiate your way out of the tried and truism that is the friend-enemy dichotomy. And it's not just who do I get along with or who agrees with me on absolutely everything. It's no, these people live according to and want to sustain my way of life, and these people threaten it. What do I do to sustain my own way of life? Well, Ben-Gurion, who was the Israeli prime minister, once said, have kids so that we can sustain our country and sustain our way of life, and I'll give you a medal. We need that sort of mentality for going to church, getting married, having kids, being grateful for what your civilizational inheritance is, despite the ideologies of the present, and conveying that down the generational chain until you are like a tribal elder surrounded by your progeny who are all sending you off into the great beyond.
Do you think that crisis of meaning can be solved in a secular fashion?
No. Because there is no materialistic doctrine that can value human life in and of itself. Fundamentally, and this is what persuaded me, despite being I'm a practicing, meaning attempting and being very bad at it, Catholic. At root of any appeal to human rights or human worth is a conviction that human life is worth something. If you drill down in secular fashion, what's the basis of that? Basically, any human rights becomes a wish list. I hope I have a right to freedom of speech. I hope I have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unless you root it in the belief that, and Peterson makes this case in his new book for an instrumental fashion. I don't think he's quite a Christian yet, but don't know his mind and heart. He says that the greatest ideal that has ever been invented or discovered is that human beings carry with them the capacity to be a miniature form of the divine. And so unless you treat innocent human life as something that is viable and is worth something, you can't value kids when they come along unexpectedly. You very rarely can pull yourself out of a depressive malaise with just, watching Andrew Huberman videos. And as we've learned in Parliament recently, you can't turn around and say, well, we shouldn't vote to kill the elderly and vulnerable just because it's costing the NHS too much. I don't see a secular way out of this. And I think if you drill down to it, a lot of secular people would say, well, you have an option to live in either a woke, an Islamist, or a Christian civilization, because those are the big powers that are making their presence very known. Pick one, and they're going to pick the Christian one every single time.
Connor Tomlinson, thanks for coming on The Next Generation. Where can people find more of your work?
They can find me over at Courage Media, where I write frequently. Very long essays for Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I have a show called Tomlinson Talks on LotusEaters.com. I also co-host a show called Deprogrammed with my friend Harrison Pitts, sort of Zoomer interview show over on the New Culture Forum, and I tweet incessantly at @con_Tomlinson. Thank you very much, sir.